In this video, I'm just going to demonstrate one of the ways to build the what we call the directed half-chord function. And there's a couple different ways we can do this, and a couple of these steps are going to be a little bit bizarre, but I think this is the way I prefer right now. So let's start by selecting a point, dropping a point somewhere on the page. Let's go to transform, then translate. I'm going to do polar, 1, and 0, and I think you'll have to change this from 90 to 0, so just type over, just tab and then type in 0, say translate, and then we're going to construct ray, and after we select that, or construct that ray, I would probably hide this translated point, so Command H, just because we don't need that. Then we're going to construct a circle. It's got the only point on the page that we have for the center, and then put the other point that defines the circle somewhere on our array. Then just drop an arbitrary point on the circle, and then we want to construct the arc. So we're going to do endpoint, circle, endpoint, construct, arc on circle. As soon as that's created, it's also highlighted, so we can then go to measure and say arc length. We're just finding the length of that as if it was a piece of string. We get 1.78 centimeters. Okay, then we talked about this last week and maybe even the week before. Now the way that we actually quantify, so let's make put the other side of the angle here in, and then I'm actually going to modify this. Let's hide that and construct a segment here. And then I also am going to want to change this circle. So let's go to display, line style, make it thin. Actually, let's make it hairline. I don't really want to see that. I want to be thinking about that angle. And then we talked about how to measure this angle. And so one of the ways we said to measure the angle was to drop a circle and then compare the length of this to the radius of the circle. So I'm going to click on the radius and measure its length. And then I'm going to compute, so command equals, I'm going to take the length divided by the length, so the length of the arc divided by the length of the radius, say OK. We'll get our calculation here. We can verify this sort of quickly or roughly. About 90 degrees, or pi over 2, 1.56. That looks good. It should be about pi over here. That looks good. And just about 2 pi as I approach E, and that looks good. So it looks like what I want. I'm going to right click on this, change properties, and change the name. You can do whatever you want for the name, but I'll call it alpha. So now we've got alpha, and the next thing that I want to do is sort of graph that. I just want to take that information and look at this value here. So I'm going to go to graph. I'm going to say define coordinate system, and then this is the point 10, which by default that's the point that lets you change the scale if you want. So I can make this a little bit bigger. I really only need to see until about 6 or a little bit more, so this looks good. And then what I want to do is actually take the length of this piece here, and I want to sort of copy it down here on the x-axis. And this is a little bit difficult, but what I end up wanting to do here is right click on alpha, say mark scale factor, double click on the origin, select the point 10, transform, dilate, and then say OK. And now I should get a point whose distance away from 0 corresponds to the measure of this arc if the radius was 1. So if I stop it here, I want to now select the origin and this point. I'm going to do Command L, and I get a little segment here. I'm going to go to Display, Line Style, I'll say Medium, and then I want to change the color. I think that already it matches FE, or arc FE, so now I can sort of think of this arc here being copied down here. Okay, so now what I want to do is sort of make sure that this 1 down here on this scale corresponds to the radius of this circle. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to plot a point down here. So I'm going to move this out of the way. I'm going to click on G and then E, and I'll say transform. I'm going to mark that vector, and then after I mark that vector, I'm going to select the origin, and I'm going to say transform, and then translate, and it should say by marked vector. Say translate, and I get that point here. So this should be a copy of GE, the radius here, on the origin, or on the x-axis, sorry. So if I lay this down here, those two should match. And what I want is for this 0.10, 1 comma 0 to fall on that point, so that 1 corresponds to 1 radius from the circle. So I can do that manually like I'm doing now, but I want to do that a little more carefully. So I'm going to select this point and my target in that order, and then I'm going to go to Edit, Action Buttons, Movement, and I'll say Move Unit Point. Speed is medium. You can change that if you want to fast, slow, or instant. Medium should be fine. And then I'll say OK. So now, anytime I want, I can push this button, and the scale here will change so that 1 radius is 1 on the x-axis. And it should also be on the y-axis because this is a square grid. So if I change the size of the circle, I can then just update the grid to match it. Okay, and then I don't actually want to see this point, so I'm just going to select it and hide it. Once it gets confusing, I also don't think I really need to see this point at 1, 0, so I'm going to hide that. So now if I click this button, the radius should line up with 1. So you can see the radius here corresponds to 1. That looks good. Okay. So now what I want to do is actually get the chord function. I'm going to make my circle a little bit bigger so I can work a little more easily. So I want to drop a chord down from F perpendicular to GE. So I'm going to select F and GE and say construct perpendicular line. That should stay. And then I'm going to need to add something just for a second. So let's add a line that connects G and E. And then let's move this point over into this quadrant over here. And let's construct the intersection between these two lines. And then I don't need to see either of these lines, so I'm going to select both of those and hide them. Now I've got the point that I wanted. I'm going to select these 2 points, Command L to create a line segment. I'm going to change the color, something that contrast with the red, or with the green. So that looks good. So this part's going to be kind of annoying. I want to get the length of this measured as if the radius was 1. So I can do that pretty easily in GSP. If I select this chord and then I select the radius, I can just go up to measure and say ratio. So that should be the length of Fi when GE is 1. So you can see the maximum that's ever going to be is the radius. The smallest it'll ever be is 1. It's behaving very much like the sine, except it doesn't ever turn to be negative. So this is the part where we have to do some weird GSP work. So I'm going to select F and I, and I'm going to say let's measure the y values, the ordinates of those 2 points. And then I'm going to do command equals, and I'm going to subtract the smaller from the larger. And now this one, it should have negative values when I'm down here. And right now the maximum is 1. So right now these two numbers match. But I want to be really careful, because if I change the size of this circle, one of these will change, the other one won't. And this is the one that I want. But I want the sign from down here, the S-I-G-N sign. So what I need to do now is so I'm going to do another calculation, so command equals, and I'm going to type in ABS, so the absolute value, and then you only need to type AB. The absolute value of this divided by, maybe outside the parentheses, divided by this value, which should always be 1 or negative 1. So then I'm just going to do one more calculation. That will give me the correct positive negative. I'm going to multiply it by the value that I want. I'm going to say OK. Now this is the only one that I want, so I'm just going to take all this other stuff, select it all, and hide it. Okay, so now this value here, I'm going to right click on it, go to Properties, Label, and this is the sign of alpha. And so now if we watch, it should behave like we want it to. That looks good. So now I've got one more thing that I want to do. Well, first of all, I like to have my circle, the radius and the unit match up, so that's good. Now what I want to do is, and I don't have a great way to do this, but I want to take a copy of this segment and put it at the end of this, so where the angle is. So I'm just going to actually click on alpha, sine alpha, and I'll go to graph and I'll say plot as XY, and then I want to construct the segment that connects those two, and I want it to be red. And now when I move, I should actually see both of these objects, not just the measures, but I see this green arc copied down here, and I see the red chord copied here. So that was a lot of work, I'm sure, but I think that will work now. If I change the size here, nothing will change. Still get the same graph, but I don't have the lengths corresponding, so if I click on Move Unit Point, that will make that correspond. And that's it for now. From here we should be able to work together.